Well, good morning. Good morning. Daryl says we should start early, so we're starting earlier than normal, but later than what he said. So, if you're keeping up with it, we are about a third of the way through reading the Bible this year since we started back in October. All the time we're asking the question as you read, what is important to God? Just to remind you that there are new scheduled readings available out in the foyer. It's the, what is that, orange? Going forward. And as you read, we're also asking you to not only ask that question, but do journaling. And so there are additional journals up here. If you need one of those, if we run out again, we will get more. So the geography that we're looking at as David is running around, as we talked about, is actually smaller than the state of Oklahoma. We would fit in this very easily. And our readings this last week have been out of 2 Samuel, mainly 5 through the first part of chapter 17. Just as kind of a 50,000-foot view, David becomes king of the 12 tribes. The ark is brought into Jerusalem. The Lord makes a covenant with David, David's victories and some defeats. Mentioned a couple there. There's also verses from 1 Chronicles that relate to that passages in Psalm 51 and Psalm 60. Just to give you kind of an overview of what is happening here, this is a little bit different map. I don't know if you can. Looks better when I look at this one. So if you see, we talk. Part of what we read this week was that Absalom flees up to the land of Geshur, and so that's that blue line going up to the northeast side of the Sea of Galilee. If you didn't pick up on it, when he kills his brother, he flees up there to his grandfather's kingdom. Did you catch that? His grandfather's kingdom. When he rebels against his father, against David, the red line is the probable line of David fleeing from Jerusalem, crossing the Jordan, and going up to Mahanaim. But that would give you kind of a physical area of where he's going. David flees from approximately South Oklahoma City up to Stroud. That's the distance that you're talking about. 40, 50 miles, something like that. So, I'd like to do this more as a moderation and less teaching, but as we get into this and while you're thinking about some of that, let me pose a question to you. Have you noticed that the difference between reading the stories in 2 Samuel and in Chronicles? Sometimes they're basically verbatim. Sometimes there's a detail in one or the other that's not in the other one. And sometimes there's whole sections in one that is not in the other one. Why? What is going on there? Have you thought about that?
David's encounter with adultery with Bathsheba isn't mentioned in, I think it's in Chronicles. It's in Samuel, but it's not.
Right.
It's one of the that's missing. They leave it completely out.
One of the examples would be that 2 Samuel has 2 entire chapters about David and Bathsheba and Uriah and all of that. Nathan coming to David. It's not mentioned in 1 Chronicles at all. It's not there. What's going on that would happen? Chronicles was written later. Chronicles was written later.
And the leaders are trying to tell the people that are returning to Israel, this is what Israel is. It would be Judah at this point, I think, when they were reading that. So they're trying to put the highlights and what makes us a people. 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, and Kings are more direct history.
Okay. So you're saying, if we look at it from a large context, that 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings were written closer to the time that things were happening, and 1st Chronicles is written later. Okay? And so they vary the content from that standpoint. Do we have anything in our culture where we do things like that, where you would see something like that?
There was no shortage of Civil War history.
Uh-huh.
But Ken Burns comes in later and kind of looks at it all and says, I want to show you this. I want to show you this part of the Civil War. Or Ken Burns says, I want to show you this about baseball. I mean, how varied is that?
Yeah.
But, we have historians come along at different times and want to go back and revisit the same material, and they see different things from those time periods because they have a different perspective themselves. The people who are reading their version of history have a different perspective. They come from a different time. And so things are curated in different ways.
Okay. So
Sometimes history is revised because it doesn't fit the narrative that someone is trying to prove or tell, and so we've been known in our culture to revise history so that it more closely aligns with the thought process of modern day.
okay.
I'm not going to go into any detail. I'll just leave it.
We've also heard the victors write history. We've heard that. Yeah, Dale. The losers revise history. I heard this analogy, and I thought it was good, and it started to make sense to me. Is that the 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings are the newspaper headlines of the day. That's what's happening, and it seems important right now, but that Chronicles is the documentaries that come later. And what seems important at the time, what makes the headlines, may not show up in history at all. That seems important, and it makes the headlines, and it's out there in front of us, and yet when we look at it a decade or decades later, we go, that seemed like a bump at the time, but it really didn't make any difference. And things that we don't even notice don't make the headlines sometimes are what changes the course of history. So I thought it was a good analogy as we're reading and we're bouncing back and forth to see if that fits for you, that in Samuel and in Kings, we're reading the newspaper headlines. This is what happens. But in Chronicles, we're looking at this is what made a difference. David and Bathsheba were headlines at the time. And yet, the kingdom didn't change. So, anyway, I thought that was something to bring about, just to bring up and let you think about and meditate on. But let's go back to the question, what is important to God? What stood out to you this week? What do you want to talk about? It's not like there wasn't anything there. Okay, let me start you down one path. Since we're talking about the differences, when you read Psalm 60, in the first part of that psalm, It talks about there was a victory over the Edomites. They killed 18,000 in the Valley of Salt, I think they called it. Who did that, according to Psalm 60? Let me find my notes on it so I get this right. Psalm 60, it says it was done by Joab, the commander of the army. In 2 Samuel chapter 8, who killed the 18,000? It says David. But in 1 Chronicles 18, it says it was Abishai, Joab's brother. So here's a contradiction. We've got three different people doing the same thing, right? So is it in error or is it what happened? Yeah, Dale?
If I would cast doubt on any of the three, it would be the king, because kings are said to build bridges, to build cities, and they never do. They authorize the construction, but they don't build it. It's like Nebuchadnezzar taking credit for having built Babylon. He didn't. He might have ordered it, but, so I would cast doubt first upon David being the one, but then I would also have to weigh it out with, David actually was a fighting man, you know? He might have participated if it was early enough in his life, before Bathsheba.
Yeah. So what was David's position in the hierarchy? He's the king, right? What was Joab's position? Commander of the army. He's the general. What was Abishai's? He was, yeah, he was one of the battalion commanders or corps commanders. So when you look at that standpoint, you're going, well, it could be ascribed to all three of them, depending on your perspective. We think about the Iraqi war. You know, was it the Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, or Norman Schwarzkopf, or President Bush? Well, they were all involved. How do you describe that? Chain of command. Some people would look at this and say, see, the Bible has errors, you can't believe it. But
Since the Bible is not verbatim from one to the other, that actually is an indicator of its veracity, that it's a retelling based on different perspectives, so that it's the same story that you're hearing different ways. That's where the difference is coming.
who wrote Psalm 60? David. So when David's writing it, who does he said, Joab, my nephew, did an awesome job in this. You know. What else? What do you want to talk about?
Describe it a whole lot, but it always puzzled me in the past that the Ark of the Covenant was kept outside of Jerusalem for such a long time, and then the Ark is brought into Jerusalem. What's changed?
Yeah. I don't know. What did you read? What changed? What prompted David to bring the ark into the city that he is now set up as the capital?
Like to suggest it's similar to the concept of taking it into battle with you. I mean, it's the mistake of taking it into battle against the Philistines, right? And,
Yeah.
but that was a mistake. How is this a good choice, or,
Yeah. That is the seat. You know, that represents that was the presence of God, because he sits enthroned above the cherubim.
Why was it left out in Shiloh?
That's where it went. Yep.
It was both, I mean, if you think of the ark as being this powerful thing, if you think of the presence of God being this powerful thing, and you think of the tabernacle as being this powerful thing, it can be powerful good or powerful bad. And the Israelites have plenty of examples of both. And the idea of moving God where you want him was probably a spooky idea. I mean, it would be nice to be in God's presence unless he's mad, unless you've done something wrong. So I think proximity to the ark was a two-edged sword. I mean, they wanted to be protected by God, but they saw people die that got too close. So, you know, was that where the tabernacle originally rested when they came to Jerusalem? And they decided that that's the best place for it? Did they think it's too scary to bring God into close proximity to too many Israelites because we're unreliable at best? I could imagine a board meeting that went for a really long time about what to do or not do on that deal.
Like you said, maybe you don't want to be in God's presence when he's angry. David is saying, hey, as long as I'm king of Israel or Judah, we're going to do things God's way. And by bringing the ark into Jerusalem, it's to say, I'm comfortable with God saying what we do here because we're going to do it his way.
I have a tendency to be like John. I always thought, for me, when I read through all of that stuff, that it was, sometimes we think that everything's compartmentalized and borderized. The people were well aware of all the things that happened to the Philistines when they had that ark. And I'm pretty sure there was a board meeting that went a long time and a lot of, I don't know if I want that thing around. And so there's probably some unwritten portions there that we don't even know about where the people were just flat afraid to have the thing back. And so it probably took somebody like David to say, you know what? It's supposed to be in the tabernacle. We're going to bring it back to the tabernacle.
Larry?
Yeah.
One of the questions I've always pondered is kind of an unanswerable question. We know that if, from Uzzah reaching out and touching the ark to steady it, that he touched it and died. But we're Christians, right? And we're part of a royal priesthood, and we've been cleansed by the blood of Christ. And the temple veil has been torn in two, and we're able to enter the Holy of Holies. Our relationship with God has changed so much. So how many of you today, if we found the ark, would walk up and touch it?
Listen, I saw what happened to Indiana Jones.
So I mean, it sounds fun until until somebody says go touch it.
Yeah. Debbie?
There's a lot to be said for them wanting to put it in Jerusalem to show that, okay, this is our God, this place. But if you read it back in, I believe it's Leviticus, it was supposed to be carried a certain way. It was supposed to be carried on poles, on the backs of sanctified priests, and they're not doing it. And I think God is saying, okay, I want to bless you, but you can't do it your own way. I have ways that you're supposed to be doing it, and it's nice that you want the ark back in Jerusalem, but you need to go back and see what I said to do, because they weren't carrying it the right way. And if they had been carrying it as the priests were supposed to on the poles, this wouldn't have happened.
I think there was also something else going on with Uzzah. Not just that it was the wrong way, and not just that he touched it. He is a son of the high priest. So this is something that he's been around all the time. And this is just my opinion, but I think there was something in the way that he touched it that showed a display of carelessness, of disrespect, of, oh, this thing's going to fall over. You know, and not realizing that it did and does for them. This is the presence of God. This is something that is holy. I think it's one of the things that God told his people over and over again. I am holy, and I will be respected in front of the people. And when high priest, did not show respect for God in front of the people, they were killed immediately. But part of that, David wanted it around him. But when he saw that, he went, I'm not sure about that.
And transported it. And later, David realized what had happened and said, let's go back and do it the way that we were instructed with the folds.
Yeah. And yet, what had they seen happen? The Philistines sent it back on a new cart, one that had never been used before. So they built a new cart and put on. That's easier than carrying it, right? No. But for the second half, but part of the deal is, David's afraid of it now, leaves it at this guy's house. Think of this guy. Great. You're leaving it here because you're afraid of it? Okay, you're the king. Yeah. You know, but for the next 3 months, things go exceedingly well, and he is blessed because of that. And that report reaches David, and David goes, okay. And I'm sure somebody did some research and said, oh, you know what? We're not supposed to put it on a cart. David says, then we're going to do it the way God commanded. And he brings it in with great rejoicing. Except his wife doesn't like it. Right? His wife, his first wife. Did you catch the line at the end of that? She has no children. He put her aside, but she's the king's wife, so he basically puts her in seclusion. He never calls for her. He never goes into her. She lives as a widow for the rest of her days. Just a side note.
She was mostly upset, wasn't she, because of his rejoicing over the ark? Wasn't that what she saw that upset her?
There's some talk about it. Is the way he was rejoicing, it was kind of like, you're not behaving like a king. You know, and
Was she jealous because he was so excited? Or? It doesn't really say.
it doesn't really say. And
She Saul's daughter.
yes. Yeah.
Background.
I thought it was because he wasn't wearing the kingly robes and everything. He wasn't acting like a king and dressing like a king. He was becoming a commoner when he was rejoicing about that in the streets, and she didn't like that. That's just what I thought when I read it.
I think he was actually wearing the ephod of the priest.
Yeah.
He was wearing a linen ephod, which means that is that is something that the priest wore, but it wasn't apparently, it was a priestly garment, but not exclusive for priests, from what I can read. And an ephod is a long linen garment. Now, there were fancy ones and there were not fancy ones. Like the high priest wore a linen ephod on which were attached the 12 stones representing the 12 tribes, and it was very fancy and ornate. And apparently there were a couple of pockets in there for the Urim and Thummim.
places in Scripture where kings also act like priests.
Mhm.
One's Melchizedek, David would be arguable, and then Jesus, both king and priest. And so that's pretty good company there, seeing a king. Usually one doesn't do the other.
Right.
Saul tried it and lost his kingdom.
Yeah, so.
And Saul-
Gave it a go, maybe.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, there was quite a party going on as it returns. I'm one who loves a good party. And so when I read this kind of stuff and there's castanets and horns and, lyres, all this stuff, I'm trying to envision this party as this processional comes back to town.
Mm-hmm.
It must have been quite a celebration.
It was a big celebration, and you'll also find different pictures because of Micah's description, dancing naked, that one of the deals is all he had on was a loincloth, and, whatever. Most of the more in-depth scholars I read on that said, nah, the linen ephod is it's not just a loincloth, it's a shoulder to below the knee kind of garment. But he was not behaving very kingly, and that's what he was doing. He was celebrating before the Lord. He was excited and happy, and she despised him. And he wasn't going to have any of that.
I think what's interesting to me in this section is how David doesn't act like other kings. I think if other kings got together, they would tell David, you're doing it all wrong. He's upset when Ishbosheth gets murdered. And usually that's what you're supposed to do, is take out the whole line of your predecessor.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the Mephibosheth story. Is there anybody in Saul's house that I can honor for the sake of my friend Jonathan? Like, he brings him to his table. So you see him, to me, that's one of the best stories of grace in the Old Testament. Or showing favor to someone who maybe doesn't deserve it. So I just kind of like, even with Absalom, how he wants to let Absalom stick around even though his son's trying to kill him. He's not really worried about securing his throne very much. I think maybe because he believes that God's taking care of him in that.
Yeah. David was definitely different. What else do you want to talk about? You're not bothered by the whole David and Bathsheba thing?
David speaking up very strongly about murder, and he does not condone it, and actually curses people who do it. And you see the removal from that. We get I guess the more powerful David, or the one that's starting to read the headlines. Where he has no problem at all orchestrating Uriah's murder.
Yeah. According to the law, what's the punishment for murder?
You have the sanctuary cities, and you got
If it's inadvertent,
the
then you can go to a sanctuary city, and if it's ruled to be inadvertent, then you are not handed over to the kinsman redeemer, but you have to live there for the rest of the days of the high priest. But if it is determined that no, that was not accidental, that was on purpose, what happens? Yeah, you are turned over to the kinsman redeemer, and it's a life for a life. What's the penalty for adultery? I keep asking the question, why wasn't somebody executed? Okay, you're not far off. Debbie?
David, but Nathan told him, because you did this, this one thing, you're going to have four, pay for it 4 times. And he ultimately has 4 of his sons who are killed or murdered.
Okay. That's 2 Samuel 12. There's some interesting things there. You say he lost 4 sons?
One that's murdered by Absalom.
Amnon,
Eventually.
Absalom.
The one that was born after, the one that was immediately born. And I can't remember the 4th one, but there is one. But it's a little more subtle. Oh, the one that dies when he tries to usurp the throne from Solomon. That's the 4th one.
Adoniah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There was something there that I saw that I had not picked up on before when Nathan confronts David. Second Samuel 12, verse 5. When he heard the story about the man that the rich man that took the poor man's lamb, David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, quote, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. And he shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity." He didn't say he was going to die. He said he deserves to die, but I'm not going to kill him. I'm going to make him pay fourfold. And Nathan says, "You're the man." And then in verse 13, after the Lord has told Nathan, and Nathan has told David, that verse 10, "The sword shall never depart from your house because you've despised me and taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Behold, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of the son of this son. You did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun." David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." And Nathan said to David, "The Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child who is born to you shall die." Who holds the king accountable? God does. We talked about the concept of sovereignty when I led the lessons on the names of God, that He is our sovereign. And what does sovereign mean? Sovereign means you set your own rules. Nobody holds you accountable. In truth, a king, back in this time and in ancient times, a king in his own land was sovereign. He made the rules. And as king, nobody held him accountable. Whatever he said was right. Now, we're not used to thinking in that term since we are descended, basically our system of government, from England, where there was the Magna Carta. You remember hearing that in history? What was that? That was where the lords and the strong men of England went to the king and said, "You're not going to be sovereign anymore. We are going to hold you accountable." And in our system of government, the president is extremely powerful, but he is not sovereign. We talk about nobody being above the law, that we have our powers invested in the government but we've divided them into 3 sections. So that no one person becomes sovereign.
This will face the next chapter. Sometimes it's missed on us. The very next chapter after this is Amnon and Tamar.
Mm-hmm.
Amnon goes in and does just what he saw his dad do. Or at least knows what his dad did. He wanted a woman, and he took her, and he raped her. And then Tamar is kind of sent off. That's a whole other story there. But Amnon should be put to death. David doesn't carry through with it. And Absalom, we see him as a bad guy, but he goes in and does what should have been done. He executes Amnon for the rape of his sister.
Yeah. And who was Amnon? David's son. What order of David's son? Yeah, different wife. Amnon is his oldest. Amnon is the firstborn. Amnon is the heir apparent. And if you look in that story, you find that King David was very angry about that. And there's an interesting phrase at the end of chapter 13. After Amnon, 2 years later, plenty of time for David to do something, but nothing. There's another phrase in there somewhere. Anyway, but at the end of that chapter, when Absalom has fled to his grandfather's, his maternal grandfather, verse 39, and the spirit of the king longed to go out to Absalom because he was comforted about Amnon since he was dead. What? Okay. He had finished grieving over Amnon's death. It's weird phrasing. I kind of got the idea, and I'm just wondering, for those 2 years before Absalom killed Amnon, I have to stop and say those names slowly. If David was agonized, what do I do? He's done wrong, but he's my son. I don't know. Oh, yeah.
He didn't, how hypocritical am I if I have him killed for him doing the same thing that I did? No, I mean,
And what do I do?
Bathsheba wasn't his sister, but I mean, I guess that's a different,
Yeah.
anyways.
So he was in conflict. What do you do? The other interesting thing to me, and this is just interesting, is that of all the sons of David listed, each son apparently came from a different wife. There's only one wife that's listed that I saw as having more than one son by David. Huh? Bathsheba. She had 4. Interesting relationship there. And Solomon, by the way, was not number 1 or 2 or 3. He was the 4th living son. So in that order of succession of oldest, being primary, he is way down the list. Sort of like David. David was the youngest. It's also interesting that even though David was desirous of heart longing to go out to Absalom? He didn't until Joab, his nephew, has the woman come in and tell a story and make him realize what he's doing. And yet, even when he calls him back, he says, yeah, he can come back, but he doesn't come into my presence. And that goes on for a couple of years.
I think David, in a lot of ways, is a really sad story because we think of young David as being a man after God's own heart, of being bold and faithful, at high risk to himself. And as he gets older, he seems to be less holy. He seems to be less heroic. We kind of think, in the church, we're going to be young and dumb, and as we get older, we'll get wiser and smarter and make fewer mistakes. And David seems to just kind of fizzle out. To me, there's a sadness to that. The closer he gets to what we today might think of as his reward, and he is still thought of very well, and there's no doubt that God loves David. But life weighs on David. David has a hard finish.
Yeah. It's hard. If you haven't figured it out yet, there's one of the things that troubles me as I look in the broad scope of Scripture is it's really hard for the leaders to be good parents, for the leaders to be good fathers. I see that theme repeated a lot. I saw it in Eli, and Eli's sons were worthless, worse than worthless. In Samuel, one of the reasons the people wanted a king was that Samuel's sons were not like him. We think of Samuel he's a great judge, but his kids weren't. And now we're seeing the same thing in David. It's really hard. Alan?
I wouldn't have really wanted to be in David's shoes really at any time. Everything that I've read and know about David, the amount of accountability, not just from God, but from the nation, from his people, his family life, and all the controversy within his family. That's a lot to bear. And the fact that God loved him and blessed him, and David demonstrably showed how he truly loved God. He led a very complex and complicated life. But one thing about David, and yes, John, I understand it completely what you just said. One thing about David is that he ended still connected to God. His life ends with his relationship with God intact. And that's really the best that any of us can hope for,
Yeah.
is that we end with our relationship with God intact.
One of the big differences that I see in David's response and Saul's response when they do something wrong, Saul's response was, when he was confronted about what he did wrong, his response was, yeah, but I had a good reason. No, you did wrong, but there's a reason I did it wrong. I've dealt with children, I've heard with children. You did wrong. Yeah, but there's a reason. If I can explain the reason enough, you'll agree with me that I really wasn't wrong. Yeah, I was wrong, but it wasn't really. I see some nods of, oh yeah, I've been down that road. David's response was, when he was told you were doing wrong, he's going, I did wrong. I am sorry. He repented, and he said, like Psalm 51, cleanse me, don't go from me, create a clean heart in me. It's a difference in how he responded to that discipline and that correction. Even when he is fleeing, as you read, and people are cursing him, and they say, I've had enough of this guy yelling and throwing dirt and rocks at us. Let me go kill him. He goes, no. My own son is trying to kill me. How much more this relative of Saul's? Perhaps God will see the wrong done to me and avenge me. Let God do it. I'm not going to save myself by my own hand or by your hand. There's a big difference in attitude and direction there. Well, the children's teachers are probably asking you to come get their children. I appreciate you being here in your discussion, and we'll continue our reading next week. John's going to be leading.